Hi, welcome to Co-Design Work with Wonder, my weekly live stream show. I'm June Beya, CEO of BayhaGroup. So Co-Design Work with Wonder is really focused on the work we do with school districts. We currently have work with youth for youth, and we have paid high school interns as well as college interns. And together we're working to create experiences that are focused on meaningful, what we're calling workplace intelligence. And that's something I'm going to be talking about next week. But this week, it's something that we're doing every third Thursday, and it's about grant getting. And today I'm going to bring back my special guest and dear friend, Kelly Cooper, and we're going to be talking about grant getting 101. And really our advice would be to start with the budget. So I'm going to bring Kelly on. So Kelly, hi.
Hi.
Thanks for joining me for our grant getting 101. And so you and I talk a lot and we work a lot on budgets and grants. And so let's actually talk to our audience about, like, why are we advising people to start with the budget?
I always start with the budget. And when June and I met a few years ago, that's kind of the first thing that we laughed about and had in common. There are a lot of reasons to start with the budget, and only one of those reasons is because of money. What happens when you start with a narrative is the problem. And people talk about, we could do this and we can do that. And well, so-and-so likes this, but so-and-so said not to that. And by starting with the budget, it forces everybody to go to the point of, what are we going to do if we get the money? And start thinking about, do we have the people? Do we have the equipment? Do we have the process? When we sketch out a budget, then the conversation turns to, oh, I don't know if we can do that. Or who would we get to partner with us? Do we need industry? Do we need K-12? Do we need higher ed? Do we need a 501c3? Small things, for example, a 501c3 is different than a 501c4 and sometimes qualifies and sometimes not. And when you take one spreadsheet, hey, Gary, when you take one spreadsheet and think about how it is that you're going to put the money in, even if it's a ballpark, as a grant getter, it changes the mindset of everyone to implementation rather than daydreaming. And if you have, let's say, 8 weeks to 12 weeks to write a grant, you start writing that grant in week 1. If you start with the narrative, you really start writing that grant around week 5, because everyone wants to talk about everything they've dreamed of doing. And it just doesn't come together as much as it does when you start with the budget. Do you want to add anything to that, June? Because I could go on for 20 minutes about this.
Well, I did not start with the budget when I started writing grants. I did what many people do, which is do the dreaming and listen to all the different ideas. And that's a really important component, but it's something that you and I talked about in terms of advice, which is that starting with the budget really allows you to have the dream, but anchor it in reality, so that when you are thinking about, this is the vision, maybe this grant is going to fund a portion of it. So, well, which portion? And we've talked in the past about that. It really should be not chasing the dollars, but that it's fueling your vision. And what that means would be to pause, really do that quick, often people talk about that napkin math. This is kind of what we're talking about, which is do some big number, just this is what I want to pay for. I want to pay for staff with this much of the funding. I want to pay for, this is what the idea, this is what's going to take to, if it's equipment, if it is other resources that you want to be able to get with the grant, do that. And that way it's just, again, allows you to focus. So definitely it was not an obvious way to start, which is why for this, we thought, for those of you who might be getting started, let's just cut to the chase, start with a budget.
The other thing is, let's say that you put together a good group and they are able to stay focused on the narrative and they are able to get momentum with the narrative. What happens when you get down to do the budget and it only covers half of what you just wrote in the narrative? Then you have to backtrack and you have to say, well, what are we going to cut? Or maybe you get to the budget and it's not enough. You have, $500,000 worth of work and the grant is $500,000 a year. Then again, you have to go back to the narrative. Well, what should we add? And when you take things out of the narrative, other than a cleanup edit, of course, but when you take things out of the narrative and when you add stuff onto the narrative because of a budget, you can tell. It feels like layered somehow. It doesn't feel authentic to what your purpose is. Also, when you're working on the budget first, it could be that you find out you need to do some investigating. It might have to do with technology. It might have to do with legal things. It might have to do with agreements among nations. It might have to do with agreements among constituents. And when you start with a budget, you readily identify those pieces that you need, and it gives you then more time to go get them. When you go out to get them, then you have a good idea, because honestly, when you partner in a collaborative effort, people are going to want to know, in a way, what's in it for me. And they don't mean that in a derogatory, give me the money kind of a way. They mean it in, well, what would I need to provide for staff? What would I need to provide for time? What would I need to provide for equipment? The work of putting the budget first is not even a one-day effort. And what will happen is then you move from the budget toward the work plan, and you can always go back and revise the budget. But what we've experienced is that if you start with a budget, it just clears out some of the things that are not going to be a part, that are not going to be a fit. And it also offers you the idea of, hey, you know what? And this happened to June and I recently. Let's apply for more than one, right? At Downey Unified, when we took a look at what was available, and June said, hey, we can only write for 2 million. And then June and I said, well, let's do 2. And then we said, well, heck, let's do 3. We didn't know we were going to get all 3. We did. And because of the support and the enthusiasm of Downey Unified School District, our best partner, that was doable. But had we just started with a narrative, what we would have done really is we would have pulled back on that narrative to fit the budget. But starting with the 3 budgets, we were able to quickly see, hey, it's going to take all 3 for us to really be able to implement what it is that Downey has as its vision.
Exactly. And the next one that we had talked about why it's important to start with the budget, is that it really, Kelly, this is something that you brought up. So operational mindset, like, what do we mean by that?
Everyone wants to know what you're going to do. And when we start with a narrative, the narrative reads beautifully. It talks about purpose. It talks about intent. It talks about passion. It talks about everything that we've started, everything that we want to do, everything that we can do, right? But you need to work backwards. You need to start from the outcome of the grant and work backwards. Today, a lot of grants having to do with the workplace and with economic development. Some of them have to do with equity and diversity and inclusion. Some have to do with technology and privacy and security and cybersecurity. If you start with your budget and then you start working on your work plan and how it is that you're going to deliver that, that really is what needs to be strongest, which means that is what you need to make time for and leave time for, because you're going to be able to convince people of how important your project is with very little effort, because you've been working on it. It's your strategy. You've been talking about it. You've been drinking wine and beer and pizza about it, right? However, that's really not what the grant reader is looking for. The grant reader is looking for, what are you going to do with the money? And is it going to create a sustainable and substantial contribution to the field? Or is it going to expand and enhance more populations, more geographies, more depth, more research, what have you? And by starting with the work plan and an operational mindset, even if it's not an official work plan, if it's you talking about basically, this is what we're going to do with the money, then it's also going to help your team focus. And again, it's going to help you see what the gaps are and what's missing. And in doing so, you now have the budget, and you also have what it is that you're going to do with the money. And when the reader reads, then they need to feel like what you're going to do with the money is the strongest statement that you're making. And this is important. What you're going to do with the money must tie to the budget that you created. And here's why. The budget is what you'll be living with over the life of the grant. No one is ever going to look at your narrative again. They're going to look at your budget, and they might look at your work plan to make sure that you're going. But every time you turn in your quarterly reporting, your year-end reporting, your grant-end reporting. It's only going to be about what have you gotten done that was in your work plan, and how is it that you're spending your budget. There's no accountability for your narrative other than you sign a contract that says you're going to do what you said you did. But the moderators and the people who manage the grant are not going to, they're not going to come back to your original narrative. I was talking so much, June. I know we had a question. Did I miss it? Oh,
Yes. So Belen asked, well, what would the perfect budget look like? That's a really interesting question. I would say there is no perfect budget. There is a budget that is realistic for, it really needs to be realistic for the work that's being proposed. It needs to make sense. It needs to align with the narrative, which is why we are advocating for starting with the budget. And I mean, we'll get into this a little bit after, but it's really about specifics. So, for example, when we're proposing equipment, we actually ask the folks so teachers, they wanted a lot of different equipment. We asked them to tell us specifically what equipment, so that they actually showed us links for the brand of the equipment, how much does it cost, how many of a certain item do they want, so that it is real. Those numbers that we're proposing are real numbers. They're not just pie in the sky numbers. They're grounded in reality. So I would say it really needs to be a realistic budget and not necessarily perfection. We're not asking for perfection. We're saying that it's important to, I feel like the other part about starting with the budget is it's involving all the key stakeholders. So when we've worked, Gary is one of our clients in Davis, and this is something that we have done so many times, which is, yes, there's also requirements for matching. So budget and matching funds, that's usually what we start with, because the types of grants that we're applying for with the state require the districts to put a match, often $2 to $1 that we're applying for. So there's different grants, different requirements, but really understanding the budget side. And so we do work closely with our clients on what that looks like, and then involving the teachers or other stakeholders and having them help us along the way so that there are no surprises. Because definitely this has happened to me in the past, where the people writing the grant are not the people implementing the grant. And the people who actually get the money and are asked to implement are grumpy because they weren't asked during the phase of writing, because their opinions were not sought, and they are then left with doing what the grant says, and it may or may not make sense for what's happening in their situation. So it's another component of start with the budget and involve all your stakeholders. So that's a piece of what I'd like to add, Kelly. And then
yeah, I just want to say one other thing, and that is regarding matching funds. We talked about this once before, but you're looking at a suite of grants. You want state, local, and federal grants. And that really kind of wipes out all of the problems that you'll have with match. But I do want to say, when it comes to the budget on the federal grants, we live in California in an expensive area. And let's just say, for example, that a PI or a project director would be paid about $104,000. You cannot put that on a federal grant because it's a national grant. You would want to take a look at where in the middle of the US, and it's usually around $58,000 that you would put, maybe $60,000. And so you're writing in the budget $60,000 for a person that's going to cost you, with benefits, about $130,000. And you just have, that's just an operational issue also that you need to deal with. But if you put $100,000 or $150,000 into a federal grant for a PI, that's not going to fly. And that goes to what June was talking about, creating a realistic budget. You don't want to say something along the lines that our staffing is going to be $100,000 and we need $700,000 for equipment. That's not going to go. And then also you need to consider supplement and supplant with your budgets. All of the things that your organization is already responsible for cannot be covered by the grant. Anything that is above and beyond what it is that your organization is at its core responsible for and is paid by taxpayer dollars or by donations, it's the above and beyond that. So, I mean, it's not a difficult thing to do, but these are just a couple of other things that you want to keep in mind when you're working on the budget.
And another one that we always talk about and keep in mind is that we're really, when we're starting with the budget, also to write for the reader. So Kelly, your take on write for the reader.
Yeah, something happens one day and you receive an email and you're asked to be a reviewer for grants, and it's an important grant, and you say yes, and about 20 minutes later you spend about 40 minutes wondering why on earth you said that. And then the person says, don't worry, I'm going to send you 3 grants to read, and then 13 grants show up for you to read. And so we need to really understand that readers love what they're doing, but it's not like big fun. And what they end up doing is reading over and over and over. And there's a lot of baloney in the grants, you know, a lot of exaggeration in the grants. And don't do that for the reader. Leave enough font, leave enough gap, leave enough white space, leave enough bullets to tell your story as though you are giving a presentation of it, as though you want this to be super easy for the reader to understand, easy for the reader to score, because it's going to make it feel to the reader like there's a high level of trust that you are clear, that you understand what you're doing, that you've taken the time to think about it, and that you're going to be able to implement that. I mean, if you think when you go to the bookstore, I don't know, you'd love to go over and you like to pick up a cookbook, right? You pick up a cookbook and some of them are just like, oh, this would be so cool. Even though I don't really eat this, it still would be really cool. And then another one is just like, it looks like it's all ads, or it looks like it's, you know, super dense. It's not enjoyable. So you want to think about the language that you use and the spacing that you use so that a person who's reading the 8th grant and is on their 4th cup of coffee and would rather be watching Netflix, that they're actually thinking, I'm glad I read this because this is going to be a fantastic project. So you really are thinking visually, not just content, but the visual presentation of what it is that you are offering to really communicate to the reader that there might be somebody that's from a more prestigious organization. There might be somebody who has more details and more articles to their name. But this group that I'm reading for right now, this group, they've got their act together. This is going to be a winner project, and then you'll get a lot of points.
Definitely think about the reader, and those details are important. So just where you have the headings and the size of the headings, and sometimes it's already dictated. However, the white space you can control. And so offer a lot of white space and follow the instructions. That's really important. And our next one is really, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's people pull these little silly tricks, right? And so if you make the margins a different size, or you make the font a half a size smaller, or anything that you do like that, keep in mind they're reading like 10 in a row. And when you read one that is different, it's automatic to your eyes that it's different. And it communicates that, you know, you're not respecting the guidelines.
And really, the next one is, our next tip would be, be as specific as possible with, I mentioned this earlier about the budget. So equipment, I've seen grants where it's 50,000 equipment, but when we're doing our budgets, we will say this is for this particular class or this particular pathway. And here's a list of the types of equipment and how many and how much does each item cost. And if they add it all together, it equals a number that we're proposing. And so that's a really important component, and a lesson that the math, that's really important. The math in the budget, it's a lesson that I learned when I was learning about grants, that I did it as a graduate school exercise, and the math didn't add up. And that was a comment that my professor had said to me. You have to make sure your budget, the math is correct. And it's something that we always have lots of people make sure that the math is correct. If a number is transposed, the math is wrong. And so those are things that are just really important. So that's part of the advice of be as specific as possible and double check your math.
It goes the same for people. So let's say that we think we know who the project director is going to be, or who the PI is going to be. We think we know the staff people, but it could be that the staff people are different. We still put their names in, or we still put the English teacher, the math teacher, or we still put professional development, who's going to be involved in professional development. If we're talking about sending people to a conference, we name the conference. Right? Now, if you get the grant, you're not you don't have to hold to that, right? You need to hold to the intent of the grant, and you need to move forward. But everyone knows that people change roles and that equipment is outdated. As such, never use TBD, never use to be determined ever in a grant, right? Because if you want to be specific, then you need to take the time to be specific. And if that person takes a job somewhere else, or if that person does not have the right credentials, and if that person says, well, I'm going to work on another project, it's no problem to make that change. But without the detail, they're going to think that you haven't thought about the detail, right? It's kind of like saying, I'm going to drive from this place to that place. And then you kind of get in the car and you need the detail of Waze, or you need the detail of Google Maps to be able to guide you. You need to think about that. And again, if, for example, you're looking at 3 areas in training or technical education. So you're looking at game development, and you're looking at cloud computing, and you're looking at Internet of Things. And then you start the grant and you say, Internet of Things, we see that there's not as many jobs as we thought in Internet of Things, and we're going to change that over to such and such. That's really cool, right? There's no problem with making that change. I mean, you couldn't change it to something like, we're going to open an ice skating arena, right? You couldn't do something like that, but you have the wherewithal to adapt, but you don't have the wherewithal to be vague.
Yes, that's why be as specific as possible. And then our last tip is we love this one. Be prepared to pivot. That means a lot of things.
Yeah, starting with people, there's always people involved in these projects, and sometimes things don't get communicated. It depends on where you are in the organization. If you're writing for your organization, that's one thing. If you're writing for a nonprofit, that's another thing. And what causes you to pivot? I mean, a pandemic might cause you to pivot. A lot of the times, truthfully, it has to do with ego. It has to do with so-and-so is insisting on such and such, and they do want to do it, they don't want to do it. Or another version of that is they are all in and then unavailable. And it's kind of, and we've talked about this before, the difference between the talk and the do. One of the reasons that we start with the budget and with the work plan is it's really clear who the doers are and who the talkers are. And the talkers kind of then disappear, they might resurface again, etc. But you have to be prepared to pivot, for example, to add another partner because somebody dropped out, to go out and get labor market data you weren't thinking about. All of a sudden, you need someone who has a skill set because everybody agreed to do something completely different and you don't have that. But again, by starting with a budget and then going towards the work plan, those things come up much sooner rather than later. So you have to be prepared to pivot, but you will never pivot more than if you just start with the narrative, because everybody will see an article, watch something on television, and come back with a completely different story. And that's like crazy time consuming.
Right. And the way that we've actually built in ways, there was a question from Marcella about have we ever had difficulty with clients and how do we handle those obstacles? So this came from years and years of bad experiences and lessons learned. So I definitely at one point had a client who I was writing grants with, and the person in charge would not let me see the budget. So it was a secret activity. I was writing the narrative, and at the end, the two shall meet. And that was a really bad, bad way because there were things in the budget that were not stated in the narrative. So that stops. That has never happened after that because one, I would not say yes to working with a client who wouldn't be open about the budget, because it's really difficult to be an effective grant writer, grant getter without being involved with the budget. The second,
they're hiring you to get the money.
yes.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, yes, no, exactly. And so to keep the budget as a secret was such a bizarre approach, and definitely also was telling about many things. And the other part The other part to keep in mind is that there were milestones for clients. And actually, in our contracts, when we're writing grants, we would say if these deadlines aren't met, then we cannot do a good job with you.
Mhm.
And so we need this information by these days. And if we don't get it, then we may not proceed. And so that's another piece of be prepared to pivot. So we're prepared to leave, and they need to be prepared that these deadlines are serious.
I know for me, I was recently on a call where the person started to take affront with what I was saying, because a person who's passionate about their research or passionate about their field really believes in it. And when I'm saying, okay, let's include that, but not this, well, what do you mean? Or let's expand this, let's minimize that. Oh, what do you mean? Or let's pivot and put this over here instead of over here. And what do you mean? And I finally have to say, we're not talking about your idea. We're not validating, we're not changing, we're not doing anything with your idea. We are only doing one thing, getting points, right? We are only getting points. This is what it says. That question is in 3 parts. We need to address 3 parts of that question. This other information is not a part of that question. It doesn't belong here. And still, it's like you can get really attached. Sometimes a challenging customer gets really attached to an idea. And you have to say, okay, that is a great idea, and it's not a part of this grant. And it's super difficult for them to interpret that and to not be offended by that. But as June noted, when we're writing a grant, we have a form and we have a set of guidelines and we have a set of dates. And we are taking as much of your passion and your idea as possible to do an amazing job filling out that form. So we're not validating or not you. We are getting points, and that's it. And sometimes that's difficult for customers, especially tired customers. And, you know, generally, honestly, June and I write for passion projects. We don't write for money because it's not really worth it. But if I say to myself, and I said this in a previous podcast or previous live stream, if I say to myself, this is an amazing project, and wouldn't it be fantastic if it could get funded, then as a grant getter, you have to be comfortable and confident to say no. And that's part of the be prepared to pivot. You have to know the RFP or the RFA well to say that is not going to get any points, or that is not going to be acceptable, or hey, you're going to have a problem with intellectual property if you do that, right? And one of the ways that I like to be prepared to pivot is I'll take the RFP and I'll strip it out to just the basics, almost as though I was doing UX or UI work where you develop personas and use user stories, right? I'll just have like these 12 items. And when everyone starts to wander, just to pull them back to those 12 items. This is what we need to do in order to score, in order to get points. And yeah, Angela, it's just, it has to be to get the points. And what happens is then they get the grant. And as June noted, you might never want to do business with someone again, or when it goes well, then people understand and respect your methodology and will help you to help themselves the second time around.
Right, right. And it's really exciting because when it does work, and what we've talked about is definitely what we have done with our clients. And so Gary just chimed in. So we wrote 4 CTE facility grants with Davis, and we got all 4. And they got the money. They're building facilities, and it's super exciting. And it's something that when I got involved with them, I said to them that there are pieces that I can do, and there are pieces that we really need you in the community to do. One of those was getting letters of support and showing the match funding for the various grants, and their community completely stepped up. I think for each grant, we had an average of 35 letters of support from folks who are parents, alumni, business partners, and it really made a difference. So those are pieces that are really important of how committed the community is with supporting the whole endeavor. And then the success.
Yeah, and then when they're supportive, what happens is you learn more. And then as you learn more and you're finally ready to do the narrative is much better, right? The narrative is much better by the time you deal with everybody, all the research, review of literature, the budget and everything. Then you're in all of that process, your narrative will then score more points because it's not something you just started writing cold on the first day that everybody decided to apply for the grant.
So some of the best parts are when we do get letters of support, because we know people are reading them quickly, we will actually do pull quotes and put them into the narrative because those are compelling stories. Those show commitment. And so we definitely make sure all of those pieces are aligned. And so, yeah, that's our advice with this session of Grant Getting 101. And so Kelly and I are actually going to be back on tax day, April 15th. And we
It's not
haven't
tax
figured.
day anymore. The deadline has changed.
Oh, well, formerly known as tax day, now just April 15th. We will be back. We don't know what topic yet. We'll let you know. And so that's our next Grant Getting 101 is April 15th, a Thursday, the third Thursday of April. And then my show next week is going to be focused on something that Kelly and I actually, just in conversation, our frustration with certain terms like soft skills and just all of the various terms that have been used over the years that frustrate us. We've come up with workplace intelligence. And so I'm going to tell you more about it next week. Please join me next Thursday, 3 p.m. with Co-Design Work with Wonder. I'm June Baya, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.